Akwai Stephanie Quinn-Davidson, Nui Siwanka, Noiaya Payun Yotayo Kisk. Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Quinn-Davidson. I just introduced myself in my traditional language, which is Mohegan. I am an enrolled member of the Brotherton Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, and I'm also of Menominee descent. Um, I am the Science and Policy Director for Ridges to Riffles Indigenous Conservation Group. We are a small but mighty nonprofit, primarily based on the Klamath River and the Klamath Basin. Um, all of us happen to be women. We all happen to be Indigenous, and we all happen to be mothers. So it's a really exciting and unique group to be working with. After I had 13 plus years of working in salmon fisheries in Alaska. Um, Apologies, I have allergies and have a cough, and so I apologize if I start coughing. I will try to go on mute and then come back. But just want to preface that I'm battling that. Thank you, Teresa, for the invitation to join you all today and talk about this really exciting coalition that we're developing. And I actually want to also introduce my colleague, Vanessa Castle. Vanessa is my colleague at Ridges to Riffles, but she has also been a participant in these summits that my colleague Kelly Catlett and I have been hosting and facilitating around tribal priorities, indigenous priorities in hydropower. And so I invited Vanessa here today to share some of her lived experience and also kind of her hopes and dreams for this coalition. So Vanessa, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie. Ait Squatchy, Eampton Snat, Ashwana Sklyamson. I am Vanessa Castle, and I am a member of the Lower Elwha Clallam tribe, situated in what is now Port Angeles, Washington, on the mouth of the Elwha River. And I am the Tribal Engagement Coordinator for Ridges to Riffles. My background before coming to Ridges to Riffles was I worked on the Elwha River restoration as a fisheries and wildlife technician, braiding traditional ecological knowledge with our Western world of science post-dam removal. And prior to that, I was a social worker, and then my lifelong history as a fisherwoman and traditional gatherer and hunter in my territory. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Vanessa, and thanks again for joining. So you'll notice that my title slide is different from what you were advertised, and apologies for that. This is sort of my MO. Um, I don't really think about the true title until after I've pulled the presentation together. And so I've changed the title of this presentation to this is also my MO, which is making really, really long titles. Engaging Tribes in Hydropower Priorities and Reform, introducing the National Indigenous Coalition on Hydropower, also known as NICH. And the reason why I wanted to change this title is, the word practitioner didn't really resonate for me when it comes to tribes and indigenous peoples and hydropower. And it didn't really capture the relationship I felt that indigenous people have with hydropower. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to change the title. And also, this presentation is more of a reflection on the time, or my time, I guess, in this arena and how I came to this and how we have started to build this coalition. Um, so let's see, let's make sure the slide advances. There we go. So I'm sure it's no surprise to this group that hydropowers and tribes and indigenous people do not have the best history. Hydropower is one of the most widespread forms of infrastructure affecting indigenous lands and waters in the US, and thousands of hydropower projects, many built without tribal consent, continue to shape our water systems today and our fisheries, water quality, cultural practices, all things that are central to tribes and indigenous nations. Over 1 million acres of tribal lands and sacred sites have been buried by reservoirs and slack water created by dams. And so, this is probably a familiar picture to most folks here of the tribal dip net fishery at Celilo Falls, which has now been buried underwater for 70 years. For 15,000 years, Native people gathered at this site to fish and exchange goods. And they built these platforms out over the water and they caught the salmon with these dip nets. And as fish swam up these rapids and jumped over the falls, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began building the dam in 1952 and completed it 5 years later. And again, that slack water has now buried these falls and buried this economic and cultural hub for Native Americans in the region. And it was also the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in North America. Sorry, excuse me. Here we go. The US government, they did recently recognize the harm that dams have caused tribes in the Pacific Northwest with a published report by the Department of Interior in 2024. And the federal government admits in that report that they knew the harms, they knew what would happen if the dams were built, but they did go ahead and build the dams anyway. And an Oregon Public Broadcasting story even goes so far as to say that the government viewed dam building as a solution to, quote, an Indian problem on the Columbia River. And this is based on transcripts from that time when the dams were being built, the meetings and of when they were deciding to push those forward, that ProPublica and Oregon Public Broadcasting were able to review. And so they viewed that dam building was a solution again to this, quote, Indian problem, and that by building the Dolls Dam and flooding Celilo Falls fishing site, they could rid themselves of Indians who fish, quote, at will and impede the state's ability to supply fish. The head of the Port of Vancouver at the time also told federal officials of the Indian problem and said of tribal fishing, certainly we don't want it to stand in the way of the development of our own way of life. And I mention this because these are real words. This is language used by officials who were building the dams at the time. And I highlight this as an example of how hydropower has viewed Native Americans and tribal people and has treated them. And while hydroelectric energy has long been touted as, quote, clean energy, hydropower projects have devastated treaty protected rights and resources, particularly salmon and other anadromous fish. Dams have decimated these culturally and economically important salmon fisheries in the Pacific Northwest. Here's a picture of the Elwha Dam. So in the early 1900s, two hydroelectric dams were constructed on the Elwha River in Washington State, and these dams did not have fish passage. There were many species, 8 species of migrating salmon and trout in this system, and they knew that the dams would impede migration of those species, and they did not provide fish passage. And so it blocked access to over 90% of the watershed. For years, the Elwha Dam was heralded for its power production, but with no provision for fish passage, more than 70 miles of habitat blocked upstream, salmon and other fish species, anadromous fish species populations began to decline. And I wanted to invite Vanessa to provide a little bit of her lived experience with how those dams impacted her and her tribe. Just again, as an example of that relationship of hydropower and tribal people.
Thank you. Yeah, the Elwha Dam was built at River Mile 5, so just above the valley in which we all reside in which we settled in via the process of homesteading and then eventually going through termination during the termination era and then being re-recognized in 1968. And when I was born in the mid 1980s, I grew up on the river and was told about the monsters in the mountains. And when we speak about the monsters in the mountains, this is what we were talking about because they were not structurally integrated, they were not sound. And we were told that if we had over a 3.0 earthquake, that we had 8.5 minutes to get out of the valley. Otherwise, we would be hit by 250-foot walls of water. And so growing up, I knew that anytime the ground shook, we would start to be afraid and like run for the hills. And this is in the 1980s, 1990s, so very recent. And the Elwha River Restoration Act was passed in 1992, Fisheries and Restoration Act. But then we sat waiting for those dams to come down for it to happen. We knew that the act had been passed, but we were told it would never be funded. Not only did it affect our fisheries, all of our fisheries, multiple generations of my ancestors and my mother and my grandmother had never seen specific salmon that we had previously relied on, like our sockeye salmon that would return to Lake Sutherland. And those were obliterated by the dams. They needed that lake habitat to return, and so therefore they stopped as soon as they were built. And those fish still have not returned, and we're 15 years post dam removal. And there has been no efforts to reintroduce a different genetic stock. So our people are still suffering, even though we have taken out the dams post dam removal. But not only that, yes, it is about the fish, but also it's about all of the other things, all of the things connected, as us as Indigenous people know, um, that all things are connected. All of the species around the river dissipated after these dams were built because the lack of fish that they relied on, just as we had. But also, this river is our church, and so our spirituality was severed. When we implemented a moratorium leading up to dam removal and weren't able to fish certain species, we stopped going to the river, which is less than 1,000 feet from my doorstep. Our family stopped gathering at the river, and so therefore those relationships with one another that we maintained through fishing were severed, and our community was severed, and our spirituality that connects directly to the river and the way of life that we had with this relative of ours was all severed. So it impacted more than just our food source. It impacted even just our way of life and our spirituality.
Thank you for that very personal experience of how hydropower has impacted you and your family and your tribe. And and I know probably for a lot of folks on this webinar, that's you know this story, but we just want to highlight it that it's still very, very real and has very real impacts to people today. Okay, let's go here, see if this works. There we go. Um, while hydroelectric energy has, oh, sorry, but we are at an important time where we can undo the harms. We can write the language and we can protect the river. We can protect the water. Um, Native American Rights Fund, NARF, just published a report this past January where they highlight that in the next 10 years, 40% of the federally regulated dams are up for relicensing. And this represents a once in a generation opportunity to have some influence on those licenses and have some influence on how those dams are managed, regulated, how, maybe they could come out someday. And tribes have an important role in this process. NARF notes that, tribes as sovereign governments with legal rights in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or FERC hydropower licensing process they have a real role in being able to influencing these proceedings. And now that seek to be involved. So that's something to be aware of. FERC's licensing process. Oh, I'm going to actually go off video for a minute because it's showing me that my internet connection is unstable. So I'll still talk, but you won't see me. FERC's licensing process, it spans several years. It includes required consultation with tribal nations, though restrictions on communication after an application is filed often limit the effectiveness of that consultation. And um, there are several ways that tribes can influence these licensing outcomes. They can, during the study phase or study plan phase, they can request environmental, cultural, and economic studies. And again, they can intervene in proceedings or participate as cooperating agencies under NEPA. But like I said, these require significant staff capacity to be able to engage at that level. So yes, once in a generation opportunity here, but a number of hurdles to overcome to really bring tribes to the table to be effective participants. And then this opportunity to engage tribes in the FERC licensing, relicensing is also coupled with a push for green energy, specifically with pumped storage hydro projects across the country. Um, in 2024, hydropower accounted for 24% of the US renewable electricity generation, and pumped storage hydro remains the largest contributor to US energy storage. It represents roughly 88% of all commercial storage capacity in the United States as of 2022, according to National Hydropower Association. America currently has 43 pumped storage hydro plants, and NHA notes that it has the potential to add enough new pumped storage hydro plants to more than double its current capacity. So, as a result of pumped storage hydro's green energy potential, coupled with solar and wind, hydropower is making a comeback. And across the American Southwest, we're seeing these pumped storage hydro projects lining up to divert water from already overutilized rivers and even from underground aquifers. So, in my introduction, I said, I'm a salmon scientist. I'm going to try going back on video here for a moment. I'm a salmon scientist. Mostly my career has been in Alaska. How did I come to work on this? Well, it starts with the Uncommon Dialogue. And for folks that don't know about the Uncommon Dialogue, it was established or started in 2018 through Stanford University's Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and Steyer Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance. And they developed an agreement and action plan for uh, to advance renewable energy and storage benefits of hydropower while enhancing the environmental and economic benefits of healthy rivers. Participants included non-governmental organizations, NGOs, hydropower industry, trade associations, government agencies, universities, and investors. And together, these participants released this joint statement of collaboration in 2020. And the statement identified two urgent challenges that drive participants to define hydropower's role in a clean energy future while also ensuring the protection of healthy rivers. And those two urgent challenges were one, to rapidly and substantially decarbonize the nation's electricity system. The parties recognized the role that US hydropower plays as an important renewable energy resource and for integrating variable solar and wind power into the US electric grid. And the second one is at the same time, recognizing that our nation's waterways and the biodiversity and ecosystem services they sustain are vulnerable to the compounding factors of a changing climate, habitat loss, and alteration of river processes. And so, with this in mind, they developed this joint statement with a focus on these three R's: retrofit, restoration, retrofit, and can't see my last R there. Apologies. Removal. There we go. One of the most important ones. And the statement defined several areas for collaboration that developed into these working groups that I've outlined here for participants to join. And so on the left here is, all the logos of all the participants who were a part of that joint statement of collaboration. And then on the right, all of the working groups that were developed that were identified as priority areas. And then participants assembled into these working groups or selected into these different working groups that they wanted to advance. And this has been going on for several years. There were two different rounds or iterations of Uncommon Dialogue. It was a Department of Energy funded effort and just wrapped up last November. So looking at these different working groups, one of the things up until the point of development of these is there was minimal tribal engagement. You look at this list of joint parties and we don't see a large tribal organization involved. We don't see tribes in there. And so that was one of the challenges that Uncommon Dialogue was facing was how do we engage tribes in the Uncommon Dialogue? We had NGOs, had industry. How do we bring tribes into the conversation? So Ridges to Riffles was contracted to increase tribal engagement in Uncommon Dialogue as a whole and identify opportunities within each of these working groups for engagement with tribes. My colleague at American Rivers, Kelly Catlett, and we were essentially the folks who were tasked with increasing tribal engagement. And we had some metrics that we were trying to achieve in that, but pretty broadly, we were just trying to understand, okay, how can we get tribes more involved or as engaged as industry and NGOs were in this Uncommon Dialogue in these conversations? As an outsider, I could already tell that this was going to be a heavy lift and could understand why tribes were not engaging. As the conveners of Uncommon Dialogue had hoped they would. It's clear that these working groups were developed primarily by industry and NGO participants, and then tribes were invited to come after the fact. And this is one of our big no-nos in working with tribes is having an idea and developing an idea and then presenting it to them. And then after the fact saying, hey, do you want to sign on to this? Step number one is ensuring that tribes are part of this process from the beginning and are also helping lead that in many ways. So when Kelly and I set out to increase tribal engagement, we wanted to hear from tribes, the tribal participants who had been involved in Uncommon Dialogue to date. And so we developed these listening sessions where we wanted to learn more about and document the challenges and opportunities in Uncommon Dialogue for tribes or for Indigenous participants. To help build relationships, which is a key Indigenous value, we contacted the participants of Uncommon Dialogue leading up to the session, and we had one-on-one conversations with them. And we went through this list of questions with them to help prime the listening session so that when we all came together as a group, we'd basically hit the ground running and everyone would be excited and ready to share their perspectives. Um, it helped us start thinking about themes that were emerging so that we could get the most out of our time together in those listening sessions. And so some of these questions are, what are the issues that you are experiencing related to hydropower? What has worked for you or your tribe with the FERC licensing process? What hasn't? What do you want to talk about in this type of setting? What are you interested in? What are your priorities? Does the Uncommon Dialogue work as a forum to have the conversations that you want to have? And if not, what sort of forum would work? So from these listening sessions, um, we we came up with a list of outcomes. And I'm going to go through in depth with these outcomes, one, because they serve as the backbone of um, why we need an Indigenous coalition, why we need a National Indigenous Coalition, and what that coalition would be. And two, they serve as good reminders of best practices of when you want to engage tribes and Indigenous peoples in these conversations. So bear with me as we go through each of these. So the first theme that emerged is that tribal engagement takes time and building relationships is essential. Um, Ideally, relationships would be developed in person and in location over a long period of time. And unfortunately, Uncommon Dialogue was mostly held virtually. And part of that is COVID, right? Like wasn't an opportunity to meet in person, and also the time or the amount of money it takes to get everyone to meet in person. So, that is a challenge when you have these virtual meetings that are occurring monthly or less and for short periods of time, like an hour. This approach does not help foster the relationship building that is necessarily to meaningfully engage with tribes, unfortunately. And as one commenter put it, an important part of authentic and meaningful engagement, in my experience, is done in person around specific shared interests. And the relationships needed for effective, meaningful, and productive dialogue are very difficult to establish in how Uncommon Dialogue is currently run. Um, so Kelly and I thought about this and proposed that, perhaps Uncommon Dialogue should be thinking about opportunities for in-person, on-location engagement with key tribal participants. Uncommon Dialogue would occasionally meet in DC with folks who were able to get there, but what we were proposing is, go on location to where tribes are, where maybe there's a tribal priority or concern, and meet with folks in their place, come to them. Additionally, we suggested that working group chairs and the planning group should consider ways to be more respectful and acknowledge that some reconciliation may be needed to build trust, and that it may take some time to build that trust back up. We talked about at the very beginning of this presentation of how hydropower has impacted tribes. And of course, tribes are rightfully wary of conversations around hydropower as a result. The next theme that evolved is that there needs to be an understanding that when engaging tribes, there are limitations on what tribal staff can represent and how quickly they respond. So tribal staff and representatives, they can attend meetings, but they may not have the authority to make decisions on behalf of their tribe. They often will need to engage with their tribal councils to provide summaries and receive feedback, which can take some time. One commenter said, one of the things that has always been very difficult was being certain that the participants of Uncommon Dialogue understood that my contributions were limited to represent only my tribe's positions to the extent that I was able to obtain policy permission to do so, and being careful not to speak on behalf of all tribes because that's something that I hear happens frequently. So not only do we have this issue of an individual who is in these meetings, maybe they're a staff person or a designated representative for the tribes, having to be careful about how they're representing their tribe because they need to engage with them on the decisions, but also they're not there representing all tribes, all Indian country. They are there on behalf of their tribe. And that can be a challenge in these working group settings or in these, high level policy discussions that are happening that have broad national implications. The next theme that emerged is that tribes need more support to participate in these conversations. The depth of knowledge, tools, and resources with each tribe varies. And the policy reform discussions that were happening through Uncommon Dialogue required a pretty high degree of knowledge and expertise. I think about some of our participants. They are like their natural resource directors for their tribe, right? They are dealing with a wide range of natural resource issues. They are not an expert on hydropower policy or FERC relicensing. And so they're having to learn a lot on the fly with this. Whereas NGOs and especially industry, they have dedicated staff and experts for these conversations. And whereas our tribal participants, they're wearing many hats within their tribe. And I'm providing quotes from all of our participants here because I feel like it lends some credibility to some of these statements. So one of the quotes from our participants was that we're asked to sit at a table we aren't prepared to sit at. We are asked to provide options and alternatives that we have no training or ability to comment on. And another one said, with our capacity, it is very easy to let time slip away at times, and then it just gets forgotten, and we're right back where we started. We are started. We're looking down the barrel of some significant hydro licensings. It's 10 years out, and a lot of the tribes here don't have the capacity to deepen, think about that stuff, let alone engage. So one of our suggestions to Uncommon Dialogue was to consider, how can we build capacity for tribes to be able to engage in the conversations that are happening. The next theme that evolved or that came out of these listening sessions is that tribes, there's structural barriers to tribal participation, and that these working groups don't work for tribes. They don't lend themselves to the pace and process that for tribes often involves too many meetings and a schedule that doesn't consider busy times of year that may be culturally important for tribes. And the scope of the work for the working groups identified in Uncommon Dialogue, especially, may not be high priority topics for those tribes. One commenter wrote also that we're not paying tribes for their time. We're paying, consultants might get paid or these experts get paid. We're paying lawyers, but the tribe's special expertise, their indigenous knowledge, and the science that they have available is not adequately compensated. And then one person simply just said access to Uncommon Dialogue is a major challenge. The working group for them, by definition, was unfortunately dysfunctional and felt like a checkbox for those who want to follow process. We did what we can do. Look, we had people show up. Um, so those were some of the comments from folks. The next one was tribal experiences, opinions, and interests around hydropower. They're very diverse, as are recommended approaches and solutions. And, tribes in this sense, this is one of the challenges, is that their priorities and their concerns, their issues are quite varied. And it's hard, to have shared priorities that are being brought forward or have like one issue that like all tribes can get behind. And, because tribes are so, their issues are so location specific, it can be a challenge again to find that common ground that they're bringing forward. The other issues that tribes, they want to discuss treaty rights, sovereignty, water rights, fishing rights, tribal trust. And the words and that kind of language those words and that kind of language was not represented in Uncommon Dialogue materials and discussions. And so, in this case, like tribes are less interested in talking about hydropower reform per se, and more interested in talking about those things that mean something to them, like sovereignty and treaty rights and water rights and all those things. Um, let's see here, checking on time. I'll keep on moving through here. And then the last one here is that there are differences in opinion with what constitutes uncommon. Um, one person identified that, a diverse coalition historically at odds coming together is uncommon. Having industry, NGOs, and tribes come together is uncommon. But another view is that an emphasis on tribes, tribal perspectives, tribal sovereignty, restorative justice, that is uncommon. And that was something that really resonated with others in the group in our listening session. So the last comment here is that there's a gaze of the settler colonial imagination of these land and waterscapes, and that mirror needs to be turned on them. They need to start doing the hard intellectual, emotional, spiritual, and physical labor to make a difference to what we're all talking about here. The burden often falls on tribes every single time, and this is where we need to start thinking and acting perhaps in an uncommon way. And I want to ask Vanessa here if this is a long list. I've spent a lot of time going over this, but I just want to make room for you to add anything on best practices or things to consider when engaging with tribes.
Yeah, I think these all cover a lot of it, but I would just like to add, like, often we are also engaging in communities of tribes also that don't represent the legal tribal entity and government. And those people are just as affected and have just as much input as their government officials. They just don't carry the weight of the sovereignty. So I think it's important to be including community members and tribal people who are affected as well, not just the tribal governments. But obviously, with all of these things, I would say early and often. That is like my number one thing as far as like relationship building. It's early before you even make a plan, and it's often, meaning you continue to tend that relationship and build that relationship.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Okay. So, what came out of these listening sessions, well, first was an opportunity for us to what I'm calling indigenize hydropower spaces. And so we had the opportunity to take some really amazing, strong Indigenous women to the National Hydropower Association Clean Currents in 2024 and do a panel about engaging with tribes in hydropower. And that is, we continue to have conversations with NHA about how they can be better partners in this work. Um, but as it relates to uncommon dialogue, what came out of those listening sessions was a proposal for tribal engagement. And we had these three tiers that Kelly and I developed based on conversations and of how we could proceed with tribal engagement in uncommon dialogue. And the first tier was involved tribal participants joining existing uncommon dialogue working groups, where Kelly and I would work with tribal participants and help them identify what working group they wanted to be a part of and try and do this like matchmaking essentially. The other option we had was working with tribal participants to determine how the existing uncommon dialogue structure could be modified to align with tribal interests. And so it was a little bit of like matchmaking and also like how can we make this working group structure be better for tribal interests and for how tribes work on these issues. And so it was a little bit of a mix of both changing uncommon dialogue, but also bringing tribes into the conversation. And then last option was developing an Indigenous-led forum that focuses on the issues and priorities of Indian country while working at a culturally appropriate pace. And here it was like acknowledging and recognizing like that language difference that I mentioned earlier. The language used by uncommon dialogue was hydropower reform, whereas the language used by tribes is sovereignty, tribal trust, tribal water rights, and there's that disconnect there. And so how can we, um, is there a way that we could create a forum that honors this language and these values and these priorities? We presented these options to the tribal participants of Uncommon Dialogue, and it's probably no surprise to you which one that they picked to proceed with, which was Tier 3, developing this Indigenous-led forum. And so what came out of that, of what that looked like, was hosting these summits, these tribal summits on hydropower, where we invited participants, tribal participants, Indigenous folks who had already been participating in Uncommon Dialogue to come to these summits and create this space for them to share experience and knowledge, ideas, priorities, best practices, all that. And also, we did outreach to people who hadn't participated in Uncommon Dialogue to date. And so we did a lot of outreach across the country to try and engage tribes and Indigenous organizations even more. And what came of that is, we had our first tribal summit in April of 2025, and that was in Suquamish, Washington. We had, and this was all part of Uncommon Dialogue. So this was part of the Department of Energy funded effort, part of the tribal engagement component. And the idea was, okay, let's host these forums and then bring some of those priorities into the Uncommon Dialogue conversation. So we had over 35 participants from the Pacific Northwest, California, the Southwest, the Midwest, who participated in this 2-day summit. It was a first of its kind gathering that we hosted of Native leaders, organizers, and community advocates, all coming together to explore the future of hydropower reform and priorities for them. The participants were invited to share their knowledge, their lived experience, their strategic insights for reshaping energy systems, all in ways that centered Indigenous leadership, uh, cultural integrity, sustainability, and tribal values and priorities. And again, we had folks representing the Klamath, the Elwha, the Columbia, the Snake. We had folks from the Southwest representing, areas where pump storage hydro is impacting their traditional territory. We had from the Midwest, from my neck of the woods, the Menominee present, talking about how dams there have impacted migration of sturgeon to their traditional territory. And we had a range of types of hydropower projects, from those that are licensed by FERC to those that require acts of Congress, to even some privately owned hydropower projects. And what kind of came out of that is that we wanted to have collaboration and collective learning. We wanted a better understanding of hydropower. We wanted to clarify the landscape of, understanding the full scope of who is involved, what tribes, what Indigenous organizations are involved in this conversation, and also demystify the processes that have been shaping policy and these decisions. And we wanted to talk about strategic navigation, like how can we better navigate these federal processes and these ways to engage tribes and ensure that there's a greater diversity in hydropower solutions. And excuse me, we asked the question, what are the most important opportunities for systemic change in hydropower reform? And there were several themes that emerged from that question, from that discussion. And then they voted on their top priorities for further development of action plans. And participants emphasized the need to imagine hydropower reform through Indigenous lens. And top vote getters in that exercise all pointed to establishing an Indigenous coalition. So overall, the gathering underscored the urgency of advancing hydropower reform through this Indigenous leadership, and a shift in power. And participants called for systemic change, not just at the surface level, but they emphasize that any path forward must prioritize tribal sovereignty, cultural respect, and environmental stewardship. And again, I'll ask Vanessa to weigh in, as she was one of the participants of our first summit and also gave a great presentation about the history of Elwha dam removal. So I'll ask Vanessa, see if she wants to weigh in on what she thinks about that first summit and the importance and significance of it.
Yeah, this was the first of its kind for me to ever participate in, even though I had been highly affected by dams and in my or hydropower in my territory. And we had considered ourselves a story of hope. So that's what I had presented during one of my talks was a story of hope of like what could be through these things. But also it was a place for us to connect on a level where often in these fights for hydropower reform, we are often so alone in our fights because of our regionality, because of the way we've been separated by the government. And for us to be able to come together and have this sharing session where we could come up with common goals to move forward for the greater good of a lot of Indian country um, was amazing because then we were able to prioritize what our priorities were as people that were affected by hydropower. And so it was, we really were like stumbling our way through it because we didn't really know as we went into this space, why are we here? Like what are our goals? And it's like, no, we're setting our goals. And that was it was turning it on its head because often the times that we are in these spaces with these organizations or at the with these agencies, it's for consultation and it's checking a box. And so we had to stumble our way through it to understand that we were able to put our priorities forward and create the path and the map for what we wanted as people that were affected by hydro. So it was really great to see that us untangle that and work through it and come to common goals to move forward.
Yeah, thank you. We did stumble through it, but we got through it. And by day two, what came out of it was a desire to have a second summit that really fleshed out like what a coalition could look like. And so that's what happened. So we had a second summit then in November, and we gathered in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so, one thing I forgot to mention is that we were very intentional with where we wanted to host these summits. We wanted to be in a place that was culturally significant for our Indigenous participants. We wanted to be in a place where we were supporting tribes or indigenous organizations, and so um, we 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 wanted to make sure that the money that we were spending was going into tribes' hands, basically, and that was an important thing for us. And so our second summit was in Albuquerque, and we were at the cultural center there. It was so beautiful. And we had many repeat attendees from that first summit, as well as new participation from Alaska, where we had some tribal staff who came down from Alaska to talk about their concerns and their priorities. And then we also had some legal fellows from NARF join us for that second convening. It brought together over 20 Indigenous leaders and advocates and allies to deepen these relationships that we built. We defined shared values and started moving towards structure and action and building on the momentum of that first gathering in April and aligning the coalition's mission, identity, and governance approach. And over the 2 days, the participants engaged in structured dialogue, small group workshops, and collaborative decision-making sessions. The gathering culminated in a working coalition name, which is the National Indigenous Coalition on Hydropower, or NICH for short. Um, the In our time together, we developed a mission and a vision statement. We identified values, we identified goals for this coalition, and then we also established a volunteer steward group. We call them the stewards. They're essentially like a steering committee for us, or even, you could view it as like a board to guide us in our next steps. And so we identified stewards from each geographic region represented who then would help Kelly and I continue to develop out the coalition. And so just to read this here, NICH is a national Indigenous-led collaboration to transform hydropower policy and practice to protect and strengthen water resilience and uphold tribal sovereignty across Indigenous lands. Really using Indigenous values to guide us in this work, building a national inclusive coalition, and educating, engaging, cultivating strategic partnerships, strengthening Indigenous leadership and capacity, advancing Indigenous sovereignty and hydropower policy, and protecting and restoring rivers, cultural resources, and water resilience. So very exciting language and goals and values coming out of this. Um, the key components of our work are connecting tribes and Indigenous peoples in a unified coalition so that they can set shared priorities and speak with one voice on hydropower issues. One thing that's missing for tribes and Indigenous people is that, the National Hydropower Association, they represent industry. The Hydropower Reform Coalition, is a representative of NGOs. So we're looking for what could be a representative of Indigenous peoples across the country on hydropower. NICH will build capacity by providing technical support, policy analysis, and resources. So tribes and Indigenous organizations, regardless of their size or funding, can meaningfully engage in this complex regulatory process. And then NICH will hope to drive coordinated advocacy, participation in national dialogues, ensuring that tribal sovereignty, cultural resources, and water stewardship are reflected in hydropower policy and reform and management decisions. So pretty ambitious goals, pretty ambitious work for this coalition that is currently like all volunteer. Um, we have a website that we're developing. It's not yet public, but we'll let you know when that goes live. We are actively fundraising. We've secured enough funding to host a third gathering this fall, where we will continue to build out the coalition and recruit additional participants, especially we have some work to do in the Northeast, getting some tribes and Indigenous organizations involved from there. But really doing a lot of fundraising to support this work because, this is a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of resources for us to really build up this coalition and implement the things that we want to do to be effective and engaged. Um, I'll wrap up by saying that while momentum is growing around dam removal and hydropower licensing reform and climate-driven water planning, as Vanessa said, Indigenous nations are too often engaged too late in the process. They're inconsistently consulted. They're forced to navigate complex regulatory systems alone. And at the same time, Indigenous nations hold this very deep place-based knowledge and legal authority and lived experience that are essential to rethinking how hydropower operates, especially in this changing climate. Yet there's no national Indigenous-led forum dedicated specifically to hydropower policy and practice. Like I said, one that could connect tribes across regions, build collective power, and translate Indigenous priorities into coordinated action at the local, regional, federal level. And that's my elevator pitch for NICH. NICH fills this gap, this critical gap, and it creates a shared platform where tribes and Indigenous organizations can learn from one another, align their strategies, and lead hydropower reform on their own terms. And and guided by their cultural values and ensuring long-term river health. And so, we're excited to see what kind of real lasting hydropower policy and systems change we can advance with NICH. And I hope you guys are too. Um, Vanessa, do you have any other last thoughts on your hopes and dreams for Niche?
I think I'm just excited for it to get off the ground and continue in a way that aligns with our values and continue to build relationships with the people that are facing these struggles with hydropower and other struggles, obviously. Um, that has been one of the most beautiful things that has come out of our gatherings is we have built relationships that are long lasting and we're able to, as people and nations, help one another to continue the momentum forward to protect our lands and waters. So that's what I'm excited
Yeah,
for.
yeah. It's an exciting time. We have a lot of work to do to fundraise, but it's really exciting and our stewards and our participants are so motivated to see this come to fruition and hopeful that we can make that happen. And so, Risa, with that, I mean, we can take some questions.
Yeah,
I know you
yes.
have allotted a little bit more time for us.
Yeah, we're scheduled to go, past the top of the hour. So I think if people have to leave, fine, but we do have time for questions. I'm going to put something very perfunctory here in the chat first before I forget. Um, this opportunity to provide just feedback in general on today's session. I want to mention a comment from Matt Terry, who's coming from us from Ecuador, and he is an active participant in RMS events, and just that if there's an interest in doing something that connects tribes in North America with what's going on down there.
Mhm.
See, many of the countries are doing in South America are in different places. Some of them are positive and some are horrible. So, networking, I think, would be really
Mhm.
fantastic. But his info is there. I'll make sure you guys connect. He also asked for the Uncommon Dialogue report that you mentioned. So if it's on the Uncommon Dialogue like website, I don't know if it's something that's available there, or we
Yep.
can just send it to them either now in the chat or later afterwards when we send out the link to
Mhm.
the video. But wanted to see if there are other, I don't see questions in the chat, but since the group is not big and everyone's been pretty quiet, if you have a question, please just come off mute. If we get a bunch, then we can go to raised hands. But otherwise, if you have questions or comments, please don't be shy, and then we'll just go until we're done. Matt, go ahead, Matthew. Thank you.
Yeah, I would maybe you could talk a little bit more about how the Uncommon Dialogue actually came to take place and how did you bring all the different people together? Who led that? The and facilitated bringing all those uncommon groups together or those groups together in an uncommon dialogue.
Ooh, I don't know that I am the best person to answer that because I came to it so late. So, my understanding is that there are several of these uncommon dialogues around different issues. There's a solar one, and this is a
Mhm.
hydropower one, but these were developed through Stanford University. Um, and then they were able to procure funding for, further development of the Uncommon Dialogue after they submitted that joint statement of collaboration. And so I put in the chat a link to Uncommon Dialogue and some of the background about it is listed there. The joint statement of collaboration is linked through that website of all the participants who were a part of it. Um, and and also I think it has some of the products as a result of Uncommon Dialogue. My involvement in it was really hyper focused on tribal engagement. Um, and there's a lot of work products that came out of the different working groups that are all posted on there that folks can explore. And there's a lot of good things that came out of Uncommon Dialogue. It just, we didn't get the level of tribal participation that we had hoped. And I think that's one of the things to be aware uh, of things that maybe were brought forward. and is that, the key piece is tribes were not as engaged as they should have or could have been.
How do you think you could improve the participation of tribes if you were to take the dialogue to another level? I mean,
Mm,
what how would you do that in an
mm.
ideal way? I mean, I understand the complexities, but especially in the
Well,
United States, it's very extensive.
yeah, I mean, I think that's what we're trying to do with this coalition, right? Is sort of flip things on its head a little bit. Uncommon Dialogue was essentially developed with NGOs and industry priorities in mind, and then tribes were asked to come to the table after. I think our coalition is looking to flip that on its head a bit and develop tribal priorities, and then we will, as we develop those, hopefully, if we get this thing rolling, um, we will invite industry and NGOs to come to the table and hear our priorities. I think what we saw from Uncommon Dialogue, how it was structured, how things were done, is that that did not work for tribes. It just didn't work. And so we're creating a space that does work for them. And then we can hopefully merge these efforts, bring them together if it feels right to do so from the tribe's perspective. Um, I think that if I were to like re-envision Uncommon Dialogue, um, it would really start with a conversation with our tribal participants and have them develop that, and then slowly start folding in partners that we can trust, that we have built relationships with, and build that collaboration and shared understanding over time.
Susan, I'm thinking it's Susan Rosewell. Please chime in.
Yeah, thanks. Just wanted to thank you for your presentation and your work on creating this coalition and the Uncommon Dialogue engagement that you mentioned. It's really great to hear more about that. And I'm excited about this coalition that you're creating. And I love how you just kind of flipped it in terms of the leadership and how the kind of putting the tribes in that leadership role of creating their own coalition and identify priorities. I guess one question I had is just I'm curious about like the members of the coalition, or is it mostly folks that have been touched by hydropower in some way and or maybe are working on a project, or their tribe lives on a river that's been affected, or is that kind of the folks that are engaged in here? And I'm also curious because you're mentioning part of the goals would be, maybe thinking about reform. Is also part of it thinking about those individual projects that might be affected by those members and supporting each other in those efforts? Or, yeah, curious to learn more about that.
Great questions. Yes. I think that I'm trying to think of all of our participants. I think all of our participants have hydropower projects in their traditional territories that have impacted them. Some of them have new projects that are being proposed that they are actively engaged in that regulatory process and that permitting process. Some of them have, hydropower projects that they have been, quote, fighting for decades. And some of them have hydropower projects that are within the next 10 years are up for relicensing, and they're trying to figure out, okay, how can we engage? How can we build, power and capacity to be able to effectively engage? Um, and again, they all have like different, so we have Columbia Snake River folks who that's going to take an act of Congress. We have, folks in Alaska, very different process. It's a state regulated dam that they are involved in. In the Midwest, there's FERC licensed dams that are up for relicensing. Folks are involved in, and so yes, they're all impacted in some way. I forgot the second part of your question.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And that makes sense, right? That there was a connection
Hmm.
there. And I guess the second part was I was wondering if, because you mentioned, it started with
Mm,
a reform and some of the goals might be, what does this
mhm,
group want to see in
Yeah.
terms of reform? But it also sounds like they're individually or perhaps as a group, different groups of the members would be affected by certain uh, regulatory processes or and also certain projects individually. So I was also
mhm,
wondering if part of this in, is about supporting each other as they're working through whatever
Hmm.
process and
Hmm.
effort that's going on in their
mhm,
lands.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you. Great question. So we do not envision niche taking an active advocacy role on individual projects. We do
mhm,
not intend niche to be the advocate or spokesperson for a specific project. All of our participants are doing that and working on that. We view niche as like, how can we support them through building capacity, through
mhm,
helping, bring more people to the table and building a stronger coalition for them, to storytelling and getting the word out about how what's happening there. How can we do sort of like a value added capacity to folks who are already engaged in those challenges and those processes. And then also identifying though, like across Indian country, like how can we influence hydropower policy in a way that would be beneficial to Indian country, not just a single project here or there, but like broadly, how can we improve it? And so I think we're kind of working on these like a parallel track of, okay, yes, building this coalition and supporting people in ways that will help them in their current, quote, fights or whatever. But then also, how do we change the system so that, it is more welcoming, respectful, and beneficial for tribes?
Yeah, thank you for that.
Mhm.
mhm. I have a question, Stephanie. When you say some tribes have been fighting a project or projects for years, are you thinking of, well, that there is a dam there, that's kind of basic, but that that's like an old problem from whenever it was built, but also the terms of a license or the settlement like
Yep.
that,
Yep.
both?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm,
Absolutely. And this is something I failed to mention. I've kind of used like tribes and indigenous people and indigenous organizations kind of interchangeably here. And I want to be clear that we were very intentional with the name of our coalition. It is not tribal, it is indigenous,
mhm,
because there are many layers of what's the word I'm looking for, Vanessa?
mhm.
Not procedures, not processes, but like, you know, what's the word? I feel like it's right there. Anyway, there are protocols. There we go. There are many layers of protocols of like working with different tribes as sovereign nations. And niche is not going to be a designated representative for tribes because tribes have their own, sovereign government and authority to work within these spaces and in these processes. Um, and also, a lot of the work that is happening around hydropower in Indian country isn't happening at the tribal level. It's happening with these grassroots organizations of indigenous people who are tribal members, but maybe don't speak, uh, officially on behalf of their tribes, if that makes sense. And so we wanted to create something that honored the work of these people who are on the front lines and working in these spheres, and be able to incorporate them into these discussions and also create an organization that wasn't going to be um, stymied, I guess, by the challenges of if you are a tribal organization, right? Like if we are a tribal organization, that is a whole other level. Like we need to have elected representatives from tribes. We need to have, MOUs with every tribe and how they participate and how we make decisions that are influencing them. And that is a whole level that is a can of worms we're not going to open.
Mhm.
Vanessa, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to speak on was that a lot of the tribal governments also don't represent all of the members in the way that they need to or can or have the capacity to. So a lot of uprising has happened with Indigenous-led organizations that are protecting their homelands within their tribal homelands, that are fighting these projects individually in their own spaces, in their villages, within a larger sovereign nation. So
Mhm. Yeah.
it's all complicated.
That's really helpful to understand, though. I mean, I think you probably are going to have to say it a million times before a lot of people get it, but no, it's.
Well, and niche sounds a lot better than
Mhm.
NTCH. It
Yeah.
worked out.
I have a question about training. If you could snap your fingers and tomorrow people would have broadly saying their capacity to tackle issues, policy, program, it would be, full speed ahead. What would people have experienced to have that capacity, aside from being 100 people instead of 10? So I mean that hours in the day, right? There's hours
Mhm.
in the day, but other things besides that, what would you say?
Oh man, I mean like the FERC relicensing process, right? And
Mhm.
and that is getting developed. I think NARF is doing some work to develop workshops for tribes in
Mhm.
preparation for, the next decade, and hopefully we'll be engaging with them on that. But certainly that like how to be effective in that bureaucratic nightmare.
Mhm.
Like I said, a lot of these folks, I'm thinking about my colleague Doug, with a Menominee Nation, and he's the natural resources director. He's dealing with hunting and fishing and timber management and all this other stuff, and he has to learn about hydropower policy on the side and be brought up to speed. And actually, Doug knows quite a lot. And the other thing too is that these relicensings, as we all know, they only come around every 30 to 50 years. So the people who are working for the tribes right now, who are here now working in this, many of them haven't been a part of the licensing or relicensing. And so it's all new. And again, like a lot of them are only working on the one that is impacting them. Um, so I think that, and then also just like lessons learned. So what can we learn from, um, where it has, Klamath, right? Like what are lessons learned from how we got to dam removal in the Klamath, um, as it applies to FERC relicensing, but also, how did we get to the point for the Elwha where there was an act of Congress? How do we get there for the Columbia snake? Um, and for our partners up in Alaska, they have a totally different landscape, but they're just interested in understanding how you build coalition. How do you build support?
Mhm. Wow, that is a very heavy lift.
Mm,
It's a lot, but that you have established the vision is great, and reaching out broadly for partnership is great.
mhm.
Um, any other questions, folks? If not, we'll maybe.
I want to add one thing, which is I don't want to like diminish at all the work that people have been doing within your organization or within your capacity to engage tribes. Um, I think there's some folks here from the Hydropower Reform Coalition, and I know there's like a lot of really good intention there to work with tribes and engage folks. And I don't want to diminish any of that work. Um, this isn't meant as a slight to anyone who has tried to do this. This is simply like this is what our participants, this is what our tribes and the indigenous organizations want and need, right? Like they need this. is a desire for this to move forward so that they can be more engaged. And so I think hopefully through something like NICH, we can see more engagement with other NGOs and improving tribal engagement there. Um, and yeah, so I just want to make sure, like, this isn't meant as like, oh, everything you've done, it's been wrong and it doesn't matter. I mean, it does matter, it does help, but we're trying something different. We're doing something uncommon, and seeing where this takes us, having it centered on um, Indigenous nations and Indigenous leadership.
Thanks for
Okay, there are a couple of questions in the chat that I just want to make sure we're addressing here.
both of your email address, you put your one for the organization.
Yeah, so
What the best one to reach one or both of you is the info
I'll put
at.
that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's for if you want to learn more about NICH. My personal work is here. They're both so long. It's too long. There we go. There's mine. Okay. And then I'm seeing here from Bernadette, a tribal concern that is brought up is that many of these hydropowers are already built along rivers that have ties to tribal water rights, yet the tribes do not really benefit from these hydropowers, and the owners are utility companies or Bureau of Reclamation. Would this tribal concern be an example of the hydropower reform you mentioned in your presentation? Is this a concern to bring to NICH and will work with tribes to address? I mean, yes, possibly. We're still in the like building stages, haven't even started talking about like what would we be taking on and what our priorities would be. Like we're still building out the organization. We need to develop some like bylaws and how does one become a member and all of that. And so I think after this next summit, hopefully we'll have a lot of that built out, and then we can start the real work of what things are we taking on as an organization.
I think a lot of that would also be like who's engaging in that. If there's a tribe
Yep.
that has that concern that they bring to NICH, then yes, it will be a concern that we put to the table.
Yeah, thank you.
Or one that you could more easily tackle, as a priority because somebody's already involved. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Let's see, just a couple more. Oh, thank you for lots of thanks.
well,
Lots
thank
of
you
thanks.
everyone for bearing with our technology and my coughing, allergies. It's great to share this with you. This is kind of our first introduction of NICH to the world, and so you guys are the first to hear more broadly about us. And I'll just say, stay tuned. Hopefully, we'll have more.
Thank you
Well,
all for
thank you
coming.
so much. Yeah, thank you, both of you, Vanessa and Stephanie, for being open to it. And hopefully we'll connect up again down the road, downstream a little bit.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And if you have
Thanks again,
any
Lisa.
input, want to help, want to collaborate, you've got emails and you can reach out to RMS as well. Don't hesitate, please.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.